He's a Helena, Montana writer, instructor, and media consultant. D'Ambrosio's recent articles have been published in local, regional, and national publications, including Cowboys and Indians, Wisconsin Trails, Bark Magazine, Montana Magazine, and Backpacker Magazine. His most recent ebook chronicles the trial and conviction of exonerated murderer Ryan Ferguson, called 101 Reasons Why Ryan Ferguson Should Be Released. D'Ambrosio is a frequent contributor to, among other internet sites, the Huffington Post, where he profiles an eclectic assortment of people. He is currently completing a first volume of in-depth profiles of ex-entertainment wrestlers, football players, and boxers called Life in the Trenches. Please help me welcome Ryan D'Ambrosio.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Well, I guess I'm self-employed, which means essentially I have a lot of free time to hike and do fun stuff, and that always sounds a lot more serious than it is. But thanks for coming, everybody. Thanks for being here. See some familiar faces and some new faces, so I appreciate you taking your time and having your time and courtesy to come out here and spend some time and learn more about Marvin's story and learn more about this book. So I was going to keep it to there's about 13 bulletins or kind of points that I was going to emphasize and get to know Marvin, do a little reading, and one of the things I kind of wanted to start off with were I was digging through some old newspapers and I found these letters to Marvin. They were written by a creative writing class at Pablo Elementary School. And one of them, this is from a kid in grade 6, her name is Danny Lefthand, and she writes to Marvin on April 23rd, 1980, she writes, "Marvin Camel is a winner. He had to practice very hard to win the championship. He proved that you don't have to live in a popular state like California or New York. All you have to do is practice and keep at what you want to do. You might get it all together like Marvin Camel did. We are proud of you, Marvin Camel," which I thought was kind of sweet. And there's another one in here, and this one goes from Don Mueller, who is in grade 6. He writes, "I was proud of Marvin Camel because he proved that Montana has something good. He proved that small towns have some good people in them, and if you have the desire to do something, you can do it. I would like to meet him in a store, not in a dark alley at night. I wish he would visit me someday." And there are a couple other letters from kids, and I thought this was kind of the reason why I kind of got involved in this project to begin with. There's one more. This is from Sherry Newton. She's in grade 6. She says, "Marvin Camel fought a fight in Las Vegas, Nevada. He won the cruiserweight boxing title of the world by a decision. He is the first champion from Montana. I am proud to say that he is a member of the same Indian tribe that I am." So I would pass that around. There's a couple other little letters in there too, to Marvin, and that was the reason kind of I got involved in this project. I've always kind of had an affection and affinity for Marvin and what he did, and knowing that he came from Montana to overcome all obstacles of race, geography and topography in class, to win a couple world titles as a cruiserweight in boxing, I thought was impressive. No reservation has produced a person or an athlete of the caliber of Marvin. Perhaps Jim Thorpe's, but so being a boxing fan, people always ask me, why boxing? So, what is it about that sport that interests you? And I thought I was going to start off there, kind of on page 17, to kind of explain why. So. Okay. This is why. In the boxing ring, equations of life and sport are inverted. It's a place where one needs to move with and transmit anger, violence, and prejudice to succeed. Amazing feats are accomplished in this sanctioned warfare, and there are no peace treaties, no philosophical discussions, just mutually destructive conflict. The slightest signal of neutrality or reluctance can spell demise. Everyone senses the danger, but boxing is not about drawing wisdom from sanity, it's about the common sense of survival. Everyone in boxing faces fears and demons that most people don't accept or even see coming. Boxers know that isolated feeling of survival and intimidation bound up in boxing's bluster. Boxing is a dark journey. Its darkness explains why writers, particularly American ones, have always been intrigued by what happens between the ropes, the primal contest, juxtaposed with the wild carnival atmosphere outside. From musty gyms to glitzy casinos, writers have chronicled determination and dissipation, great champions and punch-drunk has-beens, colorful entourages, and outrageous promoters. They have written incisively about race, rage, class, self-preservation, and spectacle. Still, the fighter's endemic willingness to endure violence, with his own demise always imminent, remains ancient drama, difficult to explain. The moves, the speed, the power, the pain, they are all a part of the boxing mystique. Blending raw power, brute courage, and trained skill, the sweet science incites a wider range of emotions than any other sport. It reveals most of the hopes and tensions that make humanity stir. Marvin Kamel discovered that boxing was an absolute experience. It produced an extreme intensity that was difficult to find or duplicate in daily life. Boxing absorbed Kamel whole, subsumed him into its underbelly. So that would probably be kind of a pretty good explanation of why. So Marvin, getting back to Marvin's story, I guess it all starts with Henry Kamel. And I'll pass a picture of Henry around. Henry is fled the Deep South. His real name was Henry Campbell. He was from North Carolina. So Henry leaves the Deep South. He flees the Jim Crow violence and the Jim Crow intimidation, and he drops the name Campbell and he becomes Camel, sort of a way to repudiate his past. So he's a Navy petty officer, and he's stationed in Astoria, Oregon. And he meets Marvin's mother, who is full-blooded Pend Oreille. And Marvin's mother, Alice Nemone, is a Rosie the Riveter type. She starts hopping trains, and she ends up welding ships in Astoria, Oregon. So she's donning the mask, she's got the hood on, and one night she goes out, she goes to a dance, and who does she run into? She runs into Henry. So they immediately fall in love, and they go back to Alice's ancestral homeland in Ronan. So Henry starts working as a ranch hand for H.O. Bell, who Missoula Bell Airport is named after. So what happens here is that Marvin's dad, so Henry and Alice have 14 kids. And Marvin, being half black, is the victim of a lot of racial aggression and a lot of taunts. So Henry, who has a boxing background, decides that he is going to teach his boys to get into boxing. They're going to use it as a tool for self-defense. They're going to use it as a way to kind of cross the cultural divide. So I'm going to read that part right now. And just to give you a point of kind of where we're going to lead up to is that Henry's brother Tommy is boxing. So Marvin's at the Polson VFW. He's 12 years old. And Henry stands over him and says, you're going to get in the ring right now. So Marvin has no skills, He's never put on boxing gloves. Henry says, well, you're going to get in there or you're going to face the belt. That's Marvin's great teaching tool. So Marvin gets in there at 12 years old against a kid named Alan Berlin, who's 14, and Alan Berlin has some skill, and he's got and he's much bigger than he is, much stronger, so he beats Marvin. But Marvin starts sharpening his skills. He starts running, he starts training, and he gets to the point where he's training in earnest, and that's where we're going to pick up here. Marvin began training in earnest, sparring with his brothers in their yard. Within a few months, he knew how to throw a jab and avoid a left hook. He understood that the sport possessed brutality and ferocity that could harm him, yet he knew there was so much more to it: instinct, bravery, skill, artistry, smarts, and aptitude. Above all, Marvin felt his own power, the sense that he was in control instead of being a victim. For the first time, Marvin felt he could conquer any force. In the ring, where men are scored on their ability to harm one another, Marvin felt the safest he had ever felt. Marvin provided Henry with a reflection of what his father hoped was his own masculinity and imagined prowess when it came to out-toughing other males and letting them have it. Marvin discovered a bloodlust that belied his normally sensitive disposition. The only thing that felt better than belting an opponent with a straight left jab was belting him again. Before long, as Marvin's reputation as a boxer spread, the racial aggression directed at him abated. Marvin walked the halls of Ronan schools with a newfound sense of self-assurance, a swagger which told fellow students that he could clean their clocks. Whenever any of his siblings was bothered or set upon by troublemakers older and bigger, Marvin warned the bullies to leave his family alone or face the consequences. When the warnings failed, Camel used his fists. From that point on, nobody dared call him nigger. So Marvin gets into the ring. You know, he has his debut, and he starts putting together a couple fights. And he meets a guy named Matthew Said Muhammad. And I'm going to hand out a little card of Matthew Said Muhammad, because I thought this was sort of an interesting part of Marvin's story, is the people whose lives he intersected with, the guys he fought, the men he met in the ring. So this is Matthew Said Muhammad. So Marvin fights him twice. They fight once in Stockton, California, and Matthew Said Muhammad, at that time, Matt Franklin, wins. They have a rematch in Missoula, and Marvin wins that one. But I'm going to read you a little bit about Matthew's tale, if I can find the page. In a violent sport filled with tales of desperate men rising from humble and troubled beginnings to become celebrated world champs, few can rival the history of Matthew Said Muhammad, a.k.a. Matt Franklin. His story is one of the most compelling in boxing. Matthew's mother died when he was 5 years old. He and his older brother Rodney, age 8, moved in with relatives. But the burden of having extra children became unbearable to them. After just a few weeks, his aunt realized she couldn't afford to raise both children, and she told Rodney to take out his younger brother and not come back with him. Rodney led Matthew to the Benjamin Franklin Parkway and said, "Let's have a race." Rodney bolted. Matthew tried to keep up, but couldn't. His brother simply ran away. Hours later, the abandoned child was found by a Philadelphia policewoman. Matthew was wandering aimlessly along the busy parkway, lost and scared. Police took him to the Catholic Social Services, and the nuns gave him the name Matthew, after St. Matthew, and Franklin, after the parkway where he was found. Franklin turned pro in Philadelphia in 1974. He was 19. It wouldn't take long before everyone in boxing knew his surrogate moniker. He took an aggressive path to the top and quickly became the idol of those who relished the triumph of brute strength over science and skill. So one of the things about this book that has become kind of more and more important is the people who were kind of involved in it, not just Marvin, but people I've kind of interviewed and talked to while doing research for the book. So in the process of doing research for the book, Matthew Said Muhammad, he passed away. So I found Matthew. He's working as a day laborer in Philadelphia, and I called some homeless shelters and I found him and I got him on the phone. And a few months later, he had died. I mentioned that in the book, and I'm going to read a little passage about that. So. Shortly before he died in the summer of 2014 from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, I interviewed Matthew Said Muhammad several times. "Boxing is no good for anybody," he said over and over again. "Getting hit in the head is no good. You men make your money young and then get out. Do it that way. Make your money and leave." The 57-year-old's conversation style was essentially a series of unrelated thoughts, one dissolving into another without resolution, a litany of rambling biographical excerpts that included anecdotes of punching and getting slugged. He admitted, "I still feel some of those punches." Other memories included having gobs of cash in his pockets, a gigantic entourage of sycophants sucking his bank account, a dream house, and a $275,000 Rolls Royce. So Marvin, after beating Franklin, he goes on and starts working his way up the boxing ladder. Here's a photo of Marvin in Yugoslavia. So what happens is Marvin gets into boxing in light heavyweight, and then there's a new division created between light heavyweight and heavyweight called cruiserweight. So Marvin's ranked number 1, does a couple little tournaments, does a couple of eliminator bouts, and he ends up in Yugoslavia against a guy named Monty Parlov in the first ever cruiserweight championship fight of the world. And there's a photo right there. That's Marvin. And to his right is a gentleman named Elmer Boyce. So Elmer Boyce is a businessman, and Elmer Boyce is a boxing promoter. And Marvin and Boyce have a relationship that basically started at the Ox. At one point, I don't know if you're familiar with the Oxford Cafe in Missoula, but Boyce owned the Ox. You know? So Marvin was essentially Boyce's, indentured servant. So Marvin would work fixing and restoring gaming machines and delivering pinball machines and boxing. So Marvin was training essentially in this little makeshift gym that Boyce had attached to Montana Music Rentals. So if you could kind of imagine what it looked like, was about maybe half the size of this room. Marvin had enough room to spar and hit the heavy bag and listen to Creedence Clearwater, and enough room basically to swing a cat in. So Marvin would finish one shift, and then he'd go out and he would start sparring and he would start boxing. And one visitor said it had all the makings of a kitchen cabinet. That's as far as how big it was and the size. So to give you kind of a good indication of kind of what resources Marvin did and didn't have. So Marvin makes it over to Yugoslavia, and that's where we're gonna pick up. Is Marvin goes to Yugoslavia, and by all accounts, Marvin beats Monty Parlov, but it's in Parlov's hometown, so it's a draw. So they go back to Vegas and they have to rematch. So nothing comes easy for Marvin. Marvin has to fight basically 30 rounds to win a world title, and your average guy fights 15. So I'm going to take us to Las Vegas, and kind of here we are in the rematch. So. It's just kind of a little behind the scenes, So Don King is there. Of course, everyone knows the famous luminary Don King, known for his hair. So Don King visited Marvin in his locker room before the fight. He watched his Camel shadow box for an extended period, working up a good sweat so he could enter the ring hot and ready to fight. To keep the heat in his muscles, he put on a white flannel robe and his blue silk robe over it. The scene in a dressing room before a fight is an elaborate slice of theatrics. Fighters work off their nervousness, each in their own distinct manner. Some, like Camel, threw punches in the air or into their trainer's hand pads. Others listened to music to soothe themselves and danced their butterflies away. And still a few others were in the bathroom relieving their bowels or spitting or blowing their noses to clear their respiratory tract. Some fighters pray to the gods of pugilism, masculinity, and chance that they will exit the ring on their own 2 feet and not on a stretcher wrapped in a neck brace. Marvin felt as if every detail was magnified by the importance of this match. So much depended on him. The hopes of his people, his state, and his own ambition seemed more than just symbolic. So Marvin, he wins the world title, and he has one title defense before he gets done in by a guy named Carlos De Leon. So in his first title defense, he fights De Leon, and here's a little bit of that fight, and here's what happens as Marvin's getting ready to walk into the ring. The Indian, quote unquote, entered the ring with a look of confidence. For some, it was their first look at a real Indian. Many had seen caricatures from a century of Western movies, befeathered and war-painted warriors, often cunning and cruel, sometimes drunk and ignorant, and mostly silent, except when whooping war noises. Marvin Camel was no caricature of the past. Handsome, soft-spoken, gentlemanly, he was antithetical to the prevalence of the Indian as a stereotype. Sauntering to the ring, De Leon looked like a serious challenger. He had the cocky look on his face as if he felt he was going to swat away Camel like a fly. He had worn that smirk for the whole week before the fight. It had struck Camel as an attempt as a major psych-out, somewhat ineffective. But De Leon seemed incredibly sharp and focused on putting on one hell of a show. So De Leon wins that fight. And I thought this was kind of a nice passage about Marvin in that fight. Marvin ended up with more than 45 or 50 stitches on one eye, or above one eye over here. And actually his face, and there's a picture of it in the book, was so grotesque, that it ended up on Good Morning America. I think they had a little joke about it as it went over the screen. Both these commentators said, why would anyone do this to themselves? But Marvin didn't quit, and I thought this passage was sort of indicative of what some of the pain that Marvin faced. Although bleeding profusely from cuts over and under his eyes, Camel refused to quit. His face looked like it had been shaved by a blind man with a sharp razor. At fight's end, he was nauseous, dehydrated, and his left hand was throbbing as if someone had injected needles into his knuckles. So here we are. So Marvin loses his world title, and Marvin decides, well, what's next? What am I going to do now? So he's getting increasingly disgruntled with Montana. He's getting increasingly disgruntled with the fact that he can't find any good, decent sparring partners, and things just aren't going well. So Marvin one day just decides that he's just going to leave, and this is sort of a powerful part in Marvin's life, is that he leaves Montana, and I'm going to read a little passage about that. So. In the summer of 1983, Marvin Camel made a decision that would change the rest of his life and change the way his own family and others on the Flathead Reservation viewed him. With little money and a chip on his shoulder, Camel hopped on his Honda 750 motorcycle and headed to Los Angeles. He packed a pair of boxing trunks, photo identification, and a notebook with names and contacts. He left behind 3 children, several brothers and sisters, friends and critics, and the only home he had ever known. Camel went to Los Angeles because he was tired of fighting in Montana for little pay. He was tired of his home life, tired of losing money, and tired of not having adequate sparring partners. Filled with bitterness and recrimination, he was tired of the psychologically inferior structure of his birthplace lands. He felt as if people were out to demean him and demolish his sense of accomplishment. On the reservation, he felt like a faded pencil drawing. You could see him, but you couldn't quite make him out. He couldn't even quite make out himself. So Marvin's gone. But Marvin gets another opportunity. There's another division, there's another federation forming called the IBF, the International Boxing Federation, and the International Boxing Federation has a cruiserweight title fight. So Marvin is ranked #1, and Marvin gets on a plane, and he goes by himself, and he fights a guy named Roddy McDonald in McDonald's hometown in Nova Scotia. So Marvin does this alone. He has no trainer, he has no cornerman. He just goes out there and goes into some hostile terrain. So I'm going to read you what it's like maybe as Marvin gets into that hostile terrain in Nova Scotia. December 13th, 1983, the pungent smell of sweat and cigars hovers over the 40,000 spectators wedged shoulder to shoulder inside the Halifax Metro Center. The arena thwacks with energy and expectation. Fans swig beer and place bets on tonight's historic match, the International Boxing Federation's first World Cruiserweight title fight. Most, if not all, wager their money on the first fighter to duck under the ropes. Roddy McDonald, 177 pounds, a 23-year-old Canadian with roots in New Waterford, Nova Scotia, and fighting out of Toronto. He can taste the crowd's overwhelming support. There was only one other person there who wasn't Canadian, Camel recalls, referring to Alvin Goodman, who was the IBF director and legal counsel. I felt a lot like Custer with 3,000 Native Americans coming at him to get his scalp. So there's a little controversy here. Marvin hits McDonald with a great body punch, right? But a lot of the Canadians, they didn't see it as a body punch. So there's some ambiguity there. Was it a body punch? Was it a low blow? So referee stops the fight. Bottles start coming in. The Canadians, start throwing things, cups, water bottles, anything they can get their hands on. And they asked McDonald about it in the locker room. They said, what was the punch? Was it a legit punch? And McDonald says, yeah, it was a good punch. It got me in the solar plexus. I went down. He's a legitimate champion. So I thought this was actually kind of funny, was that the Canadians, start sending Marvin letters, apologizing for causing a little bit of a riot and for misbehaving. So this one's great. This one came around Christmas time, and this is a card that was sent by a gentleman who says, "Please accept my apologies for the expressing of displeasure to you and the IBF following your fight with Roddy McDonald. I now accept the fact that there were no low blows and that you are the undisputed champion of the world. Continued success and Merry Christmas." So, I mean, those are great. So a couple of those kept coming in. So I thought those were kind of fun. So Marvin's reign as champion, it doesn't last very long. In fact, the next fight in, he fights a guy named Leroy Murphy, and he fights him in Billings. And by all accounts, in all three judges' scorecards, Marvin is ahead. It's a 15-round fight. And going into the final round, the referee sees something in Marvin. He sees a cut, and he waves the fight off. Doesn't give Marvin the opportunity to continue on. So that also ends in a hullabaloo, a little bit of pandemonium, but on the side of the Montana fans who are kind of crazed about the decision. No one could believe it. Marvin is further embittered by that and further kind of hostile against the state of Montana for not addressing that. He appealed to the athletic board, and the athletic board said, "Hey, you guys consented to the official. There's nothing we can do about it." So the interesting thing about this fight is that, actually there are a couple of interesting things, but Marvin has nothing. There was a man named C.C. Ryder who Marvin met in Los Angeles, named Clarence Collins, who Marvin hired to be his manager for that fight. C.C. Ryder hops on the plane with the $30,000 that a check that Marvin was supposed to receive payment for, and Marvin never sees a dime from that fight. And the fight earlier that he beat Roddy McDowell in Nova Scotia, Marvin didn't see any money because his contract was kind of in dispute, and it was in the process of being sold to one person to another. So these are fights that Marvin saw nothing for it, nothing. And Bob Camel told me this story, one of Marvin's brothers, and I thought that this was particularly kind of compelling, was that Marvin was at home borrowing money from his mom. And so here's that passage. "In times of stress, a man often does things he later regrets, and he acts hastily without examining the consequences of his action. Sometimes he repents, but it may be too late for forgiveness. Sometimes a man simply disappears to avoid further psychological or emotional conflict. It may be a combination of all these factors that led Marvin to turn his back on his home state, on his family, and all the people that helped make him a two-time world champion. The Montana athletic decision pushed Marvin away from Montana, leaving him with a bitter taste he struggled for decades to overcome. As a boxer, he had long ago made his peace with danger and risk, but he could never make peace with the Murphy decision and its aftermath. I remember Marvin coming around after the Murphy fight, and he had nothing," said Bob Camel. "I remember our mother having to give him $20. He circled around the house, looked like he was deciding whether or not to take it. He looked ashamed. Marvin didn't refuse the payment. I borrowed $20 from my mom," said Marvin. "I had hit bottom, rock bottom. It was all the money there was. It was all the money there was in the world for Marvin Camel. What did I have? I stood there on Highway 93 with the Belved one, a three-piece suit, and no place to go. I had no place to go in the world." So Marvin ends up, in Los Angeles, and he takes a couple odd jobs. He's fighting basically at this point as the opponent, as they call him, the kind of the sacrificial lamb, the guy that goes in there and essentially is the stepping stone. So Marvin gets beat all over the world. I mean, he gets beat badly in Denmark by a Kenyan, and then he gets beat in Argentina. And he has a detached retina, but he's still fighting. So he fights all the way up until 89, 90 at the age of 40 years old. And again, Marvin was essentially, I guess, what you would call just kind of a piece of meat at that point in his career. So Marvin actually returned to Montana actually, no, I got one more one about retirement. It was hard for Marvin to retire, like it is for most people in any profession, especially, boxing or sports or just in any profession. So Marvin, this is kind of right at the tail end and when he's leaving. Marvin knew he could stick around and pick up a paycheck here and there, but he also understood that his days as a contender had passed. His opponents were too fast, too well-conditioned, too confident. It was time to exit with brains and mind intact to begin again. After 17 years of professional boxing, Camel's final record was 45 wins, 13 losses, and 4 draws, and 2 world championships. Marvin Camel loved boxing. He loved everything about it. He loved the punches and all the lavish footwork. He liked the sweat and the smell of leather. He liked the tit-for-tat exchanges and the spiraling out of control. He liked the diet, the exercise, the routine, the configuration of each day. He liked the individuality, the respect of other fighters, the admiration of fans. He loved the privilege of being considered a fan favorite. He even came to love the shining dizziness and bubbling drunkenness that came after being punched. He would miss all of it. So Marvin comes back to Montana in 2005, and there's still sort of this interesting kind of estrangement between Marvin and his family and his siblings. And I try to get into that. There's sort of this tension there, Why is he not here? Why is he not on the reservation? Why isn't he home? So there's all these pressures, that Marvin faces, and he still faces them now. Oh yeah, I'm going to come back up there. I'm going to start a boxing club. I'm going to do this. So it's interesting to see that friction between Marvin and his family. So Marvin comes back in 2005, and there's a picture of him in the newspaper. He walks around at some of the clubs and the bars, and this is a little bit about that visit and kind of what it felt like to come back after all those years. So memories abounded. Memories are funny because sometimes they don't reflect the truth. Sometimes they leave even the most unsentimental man in a peculiar bout of maudlin. Returning to the community of his youth and upbringing touched Marvin. It made him reflect on the fragility of life. Seems like I was a kid yesterday, now I'm 54, Camel said. In Ronan, friends noticed how Marvin would purposefully take the long way around town, hoarding all manner of greetings, smiles, backslaps, high fives, autograph requests before settling into his routine. Marvin still sought approbation, recognition of who he was and what he had meant, especially to the people of Flathead Nation. He wanted to feel at home. He wanted to feel the love or approval of his family, friends, and people. He wanted his life to be an inspiration for young people. But a cycle of emotion developed on such trips. Once the seemingly ecstatic welcome was over, reality set in. That reality factored in profound childhood grief and ill-addressed feelings of inferiority and pain. Memories can be hidden, but not the history that produced them. So that's 2005. And one of the things I get into kind of toward the end is reservation life. And something kind of happened in one of the interviews in this. So I interviewed an actress named Misty Upham. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Misty, because I wanted to get her take on reservation life. And Misty made a few successful films. And after I talked to Misty, I got off the phone and I had this bad feeling from our conversation, because she had been attacked up in the Blackfeet area where she had lived in Browning. And she went in to tell me the whole story about that and all the trauma that went into that. And she essentially told me that she was not going to be on this earth for more than 6 months. So I put the interview in this book, and after that, there were a couple places like People Magazine. They wanted to know, like, after she was found dead in Seattle in November, they wanted to know what the interviews consisted of. And the ones I had were extensive. They were graphic, and they're not suitable for public consumption. I'm not going to ever share them. But I did tell them what I thought happened to her, and I told her that I thought that well, she had told me she wasn't going to be around. And so here's the People magazine, and there's in the bottom right corner, it was kind of cool to be asked by people for anything, so it's in there. So, but this, I'm going to read you a little bit about Misty Upham, and I'm going to give her quote. And And this is in a chapter called Harsh Wind. It's about some of the violence on reservation life, especially the violence toward women. So, a Blackfeet native and direct descendant of Chief Heavy Runner, Misty Upham was born on the Flathead Reservation in Montana. She left the reservation at age 12 after a traumatic sexual assault. She ended up in California working as a housemaid, all the while focused on her dreams of Hollywood. She succeeded. Upham had a splendid year in 2013 with important roles in 2 major movies, Jimmy P., Psychotherapy of a Plains Indian, and the critically acclaimed August Osage County with film icons Meryl Streep and Julia Roberts. Upham recently started an anti-rape campaign for Indigenous women. I receive death threats all the time for speaking out, said Upham, 32. Sometimes my people, and I could say that because I'm full-blooded, don't understand what freedom is. I feel sorry for the conditions right now on reservations, especially for young people. Anger is all that they have. I'm so lucky. But to be honest, the fear never goes away. I've tried to kill myself twice, and I constantly deal with the trauma I went through. I drink and get self-violent. While I'm here on this earth, I want to let people know that rape is violence and is a big fucking deal. But on the reservation, it's normal. And I'm not angry at the reservation, but just feeling extremely sorry for them. We are perpetuating our own demise and dysfunction. So I did this whole book kind of, I guess what you call on spec, it's like you kind of get the idea and you just do it, right? I mean, and then if someone wants it and they see value in it, then it's validated kind of what you want. But so I just did it on spec. I just kind of went down and visited Marvin. I had no publisher, no one. I didn't have anyone lined up for it. So I went down and spent some time with him, and one of the things that was amazing just to see him interact with people. And he still wears his belt. Granted he was laying on thick when I was there. That's what Norma said. But he'll wear his belt, and he has his blue blazer, and he's all natty and handsome, and he looks as cool as like a glacial lake with his blue shirt on. And I just shadowed him for a couple weeks, And there's one place in there called the Sunrise Grill. It's like this little cafe, and they have boxing memorabilia on the wall. And so Marvin is so proud. He sits next to the 2 photos of himself on the wall. And he's just dying for anyone to make that connection between you're the guy on the wall and I'm the guy sitting down. And he'll introduce himself to anyone who'll ask, even like little kids, hey, this is Marvin Camel, the 2-time cruiserweight champion of the world. He gives out business cards. He has a magnet with his name on the side. And it says 2-time cruiserweight champion of the world. And, and a lot of it, maybe someone would interpret that as sad, but I don't see it that way. I just see it as a guy being so proud. I think it's beautiful. So here's a little bit about kind of what Marvin's life is today and kind of what he's doing, and a little bit about that Sunrise Grill, because I just got a kick out of that. Wearing a smile as warm as the Florida sun, Marvin jokes with and about his neighbors. Most days his face is so animated, with friendly jibes, eyebrow arching, snatches of song, and sudden mimic impulses, that his rare spells of straight face seem out of place. Many mornings Camel may be spotted at a local diner called the Sunrise Grill. There, above the front door, 3 pictures of Camel jut out as part of the wall's boxing collage. He floats through the restaurant as buoyant as a fresh helium balloon. He tips his cap and smiles politely as passerby brush in and out. He is eager to start a conversation, and he loves to sit adjacent to his photos. If customers don't notice the hat or the sweatshirt with the boxing gloves emblem, shouldn't they recognize the similarities between the man in the photos and the one sipping coffee next to them? When a stranger tells Marvin about their life or reflects on their past, he waits and listens and then introduces himself. I'm Marvin Camel, 2-time former cruiserweight champion of the world. Norma, his wife, laughs. Sometimes Marvin says it so fast I'm not sure people even get what it is he says, but that's okay. He's my darling. And Marvin's still kind of in between, he's in Marvin's always been kind of an in-between guy, you know, being half black and half Native on the reservation. He wasn't really accepted by the tribe until he won these world titles. And he's never been in touch at all with his black side. He even says, I wasn't around black people until I was in Los Angeles boxing. And even now, there's sort of that, he's still sort of a minority physically, because he's in great shape. He's 64. He doesn't look like he should be in this retirement community. And he's also a bit of an oddity. I mean, he runs with a garbage bag on, a black garbage bag, so he can keep his fighting weight. It retains the heat. So, but in the retirement community, there was also a little bit of an older mindset, and that there's an Indian there on the premises. And I went to a card game, and I kind of observed a couple of things, and I put that in here. In the retirement community, Marvin plays cards and games with the fellas. When one of them teases him about his boxing career, Camel smilingly tells the man, "If I come out of retirement, you will be my first opponent." At one of his card games, some of the old-timers rib Marvin and make not-so-subtle remarks about his race, his color, and his appearance. They seem to take it a little too far at times, but Marvin doesn't mind. In fact, he takes it in stride, tossing his nickels on the table while joking about Columbus's bad directions and the demise of Ira Hayes. In some ways, it's an impressive scene. A powerful man, a dangerous boxer, a former world champion, letting the wisecracks and dubious comments vanish harmlessly in a thin air like a slipped punch. Some commentators were simply ignorant. One neighbor, after eyeing the WBC belt Marvin proudly wore around his waist, told him that his accomplishment was no bigger feat than if he had won the community's horseshoe tournament. So, interesting. So, I was going to end this on basically kind of where I started out on kind of the why, why I did this book and why I thought Marvin was important. And I thought I would just turn it over to somebody else, like at the beginning, it was kind of nice to turn it over to the kids. But I'm going to turn this over to a gentleman named Robert McDonald, who's the Tribal Communications Director of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes. And it was hard getting with these relationships and getting trust with certain people, but Robert McDonald, I think he trusted me. I think he trusted what I was working on. He trusted that I was going to put out something that was respectful and kind and thoughtful. And he finally let loose with how he felt. And I thought this was a good kind of synopsis of why this book is important and why Marvin's story is important. So I'm going to end with this, okay? So this is Robert McDonald talking. When I drive by that building that Marvin once ran as a business, Marvin had a little business too. He tried a little taco stand business. So I don't know if I told you that, and maybe in a little gaming arcade. So when I drive by the building that Marvin once ran as a business, I think about him and what he meant to this community, said Robert McDonald, Tribal Communications Director of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes. When Marvin was boxing, we as a people talked about winning and pride. We talked about the excitement of his career. Today, when we get together, we generally talk about drugs or meth issues or child endangerment or abandonment issues or racism or water rights, problems and more problems. When Marvin was here, we had a champion. And now I look at that building and Marvin is gone, and all that is left is another building on the reservation that leaks. So, well, thank you guys. I hope you guys had it. Thank you. I mean, I could read more, but I mean, I don't know if you...